Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR, through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you, it's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. My mom passed away a couple of hours after I told her I'd be okay and that it's okay for her to go. I've always hoped that I was able to give her the peace of mind she needed to let go. My buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient. Probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check on her vitals. They were normal. Then she woke up, smiled and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me, I am sorry I didn't marry you. My family wouldn't let me. But I will now, I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we are black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago. Because she was looking right at him when she spoke. IDK, shit's weird. With wide eyes, don't listen to my family, they want to keep me around forever but I just want to die. They won't let me, edit, she wanted to get off dialysis which was a death sentence for her. My mom and I cared for my grandmother in her final months. We were at her house pretty much every day, cleaning her up, feeding her, helping her to the restroom, and keeping her company. My grandfather was and is still alive, but he's a shit. We had already done our crying and mourning, and were ready to let her go when the time came. When she was clinging to life in the hospital, my aunt and uncles came out of the woodworks. The doctor asked if they should resuscitate and they all emphatically said yes, to do whatever it takes to keep her alive. Basically they were guilty about not having come around until her final moments, and wanted to drag out her misery to make themselves feel better. My mom and I put our foot down. That's not what Grandma wanted, and it sure as hell wasn't what she deserved. It was a fight but we won in the end and she was able to go without a fight when it was time. People can be real selfish assholes. I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband, wife, parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away, and he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years, she's my whole life. What do I do without her? It breaks me every time." I see you, nurse, here. I relate to this so much. Had a patient in her 30s who was dying after being hit by a drunk driver. Her husband was at the bedside repeating, "What do I do? What do I do?" while crying. They had already lost their baby girl in the accident. Every healthcare worker who entered that room was deeply affected by that. It was awful. Nurse. In hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, responds to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. My grandpa was similar, struggling to hang on but not responsive. My grandma grabbed his hand and said, "It's okay, you can go, the kids will take care of me." He was gone within the hour. He loved her so much that it wasn't a surprise that he needed her permission to die. Not the very last words, but I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears, but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. I've always told patients they may die if things are heading south rapidly. Remind them that we will do everything we can regardless. So far they've all responded just like what you've described. I still question if I'm doing the right thing though. Edit, these individuals were informed after explicitly asking whether they would die or not. I do my best to take everyone's individual preferences into account. It would be the right thing for me, certainly. Time to gather my thoughts and make peace with myself would be a great blessing. Nursing home. Most elderly people are at ease as they get nearer and nearer to death. But this old lady, as she deteriorated over her last week or so, would scream, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die." Really heartbreaking to see. Oh no, this is so sad. I feel like this as well when I think about my, hopefully far into the future, natural death. I think what really makes it scary is all the trivial shit doesn't matter when you're facing death. Dishes, the lawn, picking up OT, etc. After reading this thread I think I am just going to go home tonight, not complain about anything, and watch Bubble Guppies with my daughter even though I hate that damn show. My husband is a PICU nurse and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights, the little boy would wake up so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that, he read him a book then just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning, his little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband and he felt terrible about it because, clearly, he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. Not a medical worker, but I went with my father to say goodbye to my great-uncle, his uncle. He was suffering from dementia and clearly on the way out, he no longer recognized people. My father was an only child, and spent most of his time being raised by his uncles, as his father ran a farm all day. Anyway, we're sitting there, and great-uncle is snoozing. He suddenly wakes up and clearly sees my father and starts talking to him about a barn and describing it in great detail. Like, he's talking about where it is, the way the paint was flaking off in one corner, and so on. My father is quieter than normal and just saying, yes, over and over as he describes the barn. Then, just before great-uncle loses consciousness, he describes going into the barn and setting it on fire. Turns out that my grandfather and great-uncle were having a helluva dispute at one time and burned down the barn to get back at him. Everyone suspected, but never knew for sure. Edit, looks like I forgot the last words, most of them were mumbles, but he spoke about how the fire lit up the night and how it took a while to catch. I'm an intern at a home for patients with Alzheimer and have only been there for a few weeks. The first patient to pass during my internship said, "Who am I?" For some reason it saddens me deeply and I can't seem to let it go. Alzheimer patients hit me hard. I used to think it was funny that my great-grandpa couldn't remember simple things like my age and name, though he never forgot my face, or when he had ice cream last, even if we had literally just gotten back from a drive to get ice cream. He passed when I was maybe 9, and I don't think I fully realized until years later how much it was actually deteriorating him. It's the worst disease, just watching the confusing, frustration and sadness in their eyes. However, sometimes the smallest things can make them happy and that's worth it all even though they can have forgotten it soon after. RN here. I don't remember this guy's admitting diagnosis, he wasn't assigned to me, but my coworker asked me to help start an IV on him. He needed a unit of blood and his peripheral access had gone bad. I placed a tourniquet and was ready to stick, then he looked at me and said, "I'm dying," immediately went unresponsive. I checked his pupils, I watched one dilate and the other constrict. We coded him, never got him back. As a former EMT I can't count the number of people who said or screamed, "I am dying," in the back of the ambulance, but, I always could tell by the look in the eyes of the ones who really knew it and were not just panicking. 100% agree. I was a baby nurse when the aforementioned incident happened, now I also can tell. Can I smoke in here? We were on an ambulance. What did they die from? Suicide by pills. Thank you for watching. I hope that you liked this video. Be sure to subscribe for more videos like this one.